kind of scouring the internet for information, and I thought, something's not right. I don't have postpartum depression. Of course, I'm self-diagnosing, but I don't have postpartum depression, but I am not me. This is not me. I never doubted my parenting until I had postpartum anxiety. Welcome to the Perinatal Wellbeing Podcast. I'm Chrstine, your host and certified perinatal mental health professional. This podcast is all about authentic conversations. We want to open up the discussions around perinatal health and well-being, from mood and anxiety disorders to breastfeeding to grief and loss in the perinatal period, and everything in between. While this is not therapy or medical advice, it is the place where we are going to continue to open up the discussion around all things perinatal mental, physical, emotional, and sexual health to help reduce stigma and break down these barriers to support. I acknowledge that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships, both historic and modern, with the territories upon which Perinatal Wellbeing Ontario is located. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. I am proud to acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario. I acknowledge that I am a settler on these lands, and it is on these ancestral and treaty lands that I live, learn, and work. Hello and welcome to episode number 1 on the Perinatal Wellbeing Podcast. On today's podcast, I am going to share with you my story about postpartum anxiety and depression after I had my third baby. Today's episode will include some discussion around suicidal thoughts and intrusive thoughts. The reason why I'm starting with my story is, first of all, to share with you what I went through and what those signs and symptoms looked like for me in real life. So yes, it's super important to, know the definition and understand language and those maybe more clinical diagnoses and definitions. However, the goal of this podcast is really to be able to relate to real life. And so I did experience postpartum depression and anxiety, and with that, a lot of symptoms. And so this kind of gives us a starting point for the podcast of what we are going to talk about. And of course, I acknowledge that my story is my own, and not everyone's story is going to look the same as mine. However, I think it's really helpful when we can hear that someone else is experiencing something that sounds similar to what I'm experiencing. To give you a little backstory, I have 3 boys, and the youngest is now 9 years old. And with my third, I developed postpartum anxiety and depression. With my first 2, I did not experience postpartum depression or anxiety. With my first one, I did experience the baby blues. And so that was really the 2 weeks of feeling kind of weepy and sad and emotional and thinking, oh my gosh, what have we done? We've made a big mistake. But I also love him at the same time. So that was really weird. And really, though, at that 2-week mark, the weepiness and the sadness kind of lifted and I felt much better. Also, I struggled with breastfeeding with all 3 of my kids. And with the first, it was really tough because it blindsided me and I had no idea really that breastfeeding could be so hard and that I didn't just automatically know how to do it or how to troubleshoot when things weren't working out so well. And we will be talking about breastfeeding in a separate podcast. When I had my third kid, I think that I thought, and maybe the people around me, even my doctor, thought, okay, this is your third. You know what you're doing. You've been here, done that, got the stretch marks. My doctor never asked me how I was feeling emotionally. I mean, let's be fair, she didn't really ask me how I was feeling emotionally through any of my pregnancies, even despite the fact that I did struggle with breastfeeding and I said that I really wanted to make a go of breastfeeding with my third. But there was never any discussion of my mental health. During my pregnancy, we moved, and I was also kind of feeling a lot of stress around work and not really knowing what I wanted to do with my career. There was, stress there. And the reason why I highlight that is because we look at, that pregnancy period of what was going on. If there were, big life changes, high levels of stress, those things can contribute to perinatal mood and anxiety disorders after delivery. When I gave birth, delivery was great. It went well. As soon as I gave birth, though, I do remember kind of feeling uncomfortable, like wanting to leave the hospital. I just wanted to get home. I don't know if that was because there's 2 little ones at home. I just remember feeling like, get me out of here. We got home from the hospital. Everything was fine. Baby was healthy. All was well. Honestly, it's kind of a blur. I don't really remember a ton about that time. But again, just that feeling of like, get me home, get me home, get me home. So I don't know if that was anxiety kind of already present. Fairly quickly, I was feeling not like myself. I was feeling quite down, quite sad, weepy, like crying a lot, and just really hyper focused on the breastfeeding. And I remember thinking, okay, this is my third kid and I am going to breastfeed this baby, and I'm going to breastfeed him exclusively. It's got to be all or nothing. And that was really present for me, that all or nothing thinking. At the time, I was not a therapist. I was not in the field of mental health. I was working in the corporate world, so to speak, and I didn't have the knowledge that I have now. Even people that have the knowledge experience postpartum depression or anxiety symptoms, and they don't recognize it. So again, I say that to normalize that. When we're in it, it's really hard to figure out what the heck is going on. I just remember quickly feeling like my older 2 children were just too much for me to handle. I couldn't cope with them. I was constantly telling them to go play downstairs, leave mommy alone. I have to take care of the baby. That didn't feel great. But in the moment, again, I was so hyper focused on breastfeeding my baby and doing it perfectly. I have to do this perfectly or it's going to fail again. And so that became my entire focus in that very early postnatal period. I was going to a lactation clinic twice a week. I was going to the baby's family doctor, and then he referred us to a pediatrician because he was losing weight. I was going to several appointments a week. That added a ton of stress. I also started developing this fear of leaving the house with 3 kids. I remember thinking, how do people leave the house with 3 children? This seems impossible. I mean, in hindsight and even after recovery, leaving the house with 3 children is difficult. But I was genuinely afraid of it. If I had an appointment the next day, which was usually at least 3 times a week, the night before I couldn't sleep, I would be waking up in the middle of the night and checking the diaper bag to see if I had packed it properly, if I had enough supplies, was everything in there, what if I forgot something? And then it kind of developed into a compulsion where I had to check that diaper bag constantly. I also remember experiencing excessive guilt as I progressed and as the breastfeeding was not going as planned and I was not feeding him exclusively with breast milk, which again, I viewed as not good enough. He needs to be exclusively breastfed. This kid's going to be the one. This kid's going to validate that I'm a good mom. And that wasn't happening. And so the guilt and shame came in pretty quick. They found their entryway and they were in there like a flash. I'm not a good mom. I'm not a good mom for my kids. I am not doing this right. There's something wrong with me. Like I felt definitely like broken. Like my body was not working how it was supposed to. Isn't it natural for women to breastfeed. And so there was also part of me that didn't feel feminine enough. If my breasts don't work and don't produce milk for my kid, I must not be feminine enough. And all of these thoughts and these big concepts are swirling through my head. Lack of sleep, the constant running to doctor's appointments, that was taking its toll. Very tired, having a newborn and 2 little ones at home. I felt like all I could do was really feed them. And I look back and I'm like, okay, I fed them. They were fed, That was the best I could do in that moment. I was not about to be doing crafts and special things with them and activities. I just wasn't able to, but that added to the guilt. Again, I'm not, doing what I should do as a mom. I'm not engaging their brains. What kind of mom am I? Social media came in at this point in terms of comparing myself. And those comparisons start coming in when we are disconnected from ourselves. And I'm highlighting this on purpose because I see this with my clients every day. It's so easy to go on social media and think, oh my gosh, that mom has it all together. She looks perfect. No one's perfect. Nothing's perfect. But we see these things on social media and think, oh my gosh, like I'm not even doing anything with my kids. And look at these kids doing all these crafts, or they're baking a cake, or they're learning a language. And I don't even know what my kid's doing. They're just playing with each other with toys or watching TV or whatever. That really played on me. And it got to the point where I couldn't, just seeing anyone post pictures of their kids on social media just was so upsetting for me, because I really felt like anything that they posted was just so much better than the life that I was actually living. One day at the lactation clinic, I was just crying. I think I was feeding the baby for about an hour and a half, and I was just crying, like the tears were just streaming, and I kept saying I'm not doing well. I'm not doing this perfectly. I can't, I just want to be able to exclusively breastfeed and not have to worry about bottles and just walk out of the house and breastfeed my baby like all these women online, And the lactation consultant said, maybe the tears are a bit more than just about the breastfeeding. Maybe it's a good idea to talk to your doctor about postpartum. And I was like, oh, okay. And so, of course, what do we all do? The first thing I did was Google. I think I was in a Loblaws parking lot. Of course, I Googled postpartum depression because that's all I knew. I didn't know that postpartum anxiety was a thing. I just knew PPD, postpartum depression. And so I looked at the signs and symptoms, and part of me was like, yeah, I have all those. But the other part of me was like, I feel really anxious all the time. I don't really feel depressed. I feel more like I'm go, 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 just running. I don't feel down and depressed. That was kind of tough because then I was just doubting. I'm like, I think it's just the breastfeeding. I think if I just do better with the breastfeeding, I'll feel better. So then that just fueled the fire for me to quote unquote try harder. By this point, I was pumping, I was feeding constantly, trying to get my milk production up. I was taking medication for it, pumping in the middle of the night, which I found really hard because I was all alone, everyone's sleeping, and that really contributed to feelings of isolation. I'm all alone in this. No one understands what I'm going through, and I'm not good at this. I want to stop pumping, but that would make me a bad mom. And so things just kind of kept going. And the other things I was noticing too was just this lack of joy, this dark cloud, thick fog that really surrounded my life and my brain. And I couldn't really fully enjoy, if my kids were being cute or doing something funny. I was just like, oh, haha, but not really feeling that, feeling really disconnected from everyone around me, not being able to find joy in things that I usually find joy in. Again, like I said, really, I could not cope being alone with my kids, and I was alone with them all day. Eventually, through like halfway through my maternity leave, my son started school, or maybe he was already in school. No, he was already in school. However, I was home with the other one, and taking him to school and picking him up from school like that, it just felt impossible. It felt so hard to get the baby and the kids ready, out the door, go to school. And so this fear just kept developing around leaving the house. I did have thoughts, intrusive thoughts. And so I do have a separate podcast episode about intrusive thoughts, so stay tuned for that. The reason why I have a separate episode is because it's super common, and it's an issue that I see a lot in my practice, and I think it deserves kind of that space to really explore it in depth. And so intrusive thoughts just means thoughts that pop in your head. In this case, they were unwanted intrusive thoughts. For me, it was thoughts about my baby's safety. What if he fell down the stairs, or what if I dropped him down the stairs? Also, thoughts about myself. I'm not really the best mom for these kids. My husband could do way better. I'm sure they would all be better off if I wasn't here. I also had thoughts about, well, if I can't breastfeed, then any stranger off the street could come and feed my baby, and my baby would just love them, like his mother. And that one really hurt, because I felt just that complete and utter disconnection from being a mother, which is something that is very tied to myself. When something's tied to yourself and your values, and you feel disconnected from that, that's when, things like anxiety, depression, those things come in pretty quickly. Around my 6-week checkup was when I was, really kind of scouring the internet for information, and I thought, something's not right. I don't have postpartum depression. Of course, I'm self-diagnosing, but I don't have postpartum depression, but I am not me. This is not me. I never doubted my parenting until I had postpartum anxiety. I never doubted myself. I certainly did not think that I was the best parent in the world. I knew I was the best parent for my boys. And when I had my third and I was experiencing that anxiety, I thought, oh no, I'm not good at this. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm a mess. All the things. And I never felt doubt before that. So I knew something's not right. So I go to my 6-week checkup, third kid again. So I highlight that because I think that factors into, not a lot of people talk about postpartum depression or anxiety or any mood disorder after the third kid. It's always like, oh, when you're a new parent, it feels so scary adjusting to parenthood, and that can cause anxiety, which it does for every parent, absolutely, but it can cause, anxiety to really increase. And yeah, while that's true, it's like, well, what about those of us that experienced this after the second, third, or beyond, however many kids, right? Because there was also that feeling for me of, well, why am I feeling this now? I'm a seasoned mom. This is my third kid. Like, I should be able to cope. So I think that contributed to the shame. I go for my 6-week appointment. I'm sobbing, telling my doctor that the breastfeeding isn't working. I can't exclusively breastfeed. I have to give him formula. That feels like a failure. And I don't even remember what she said, to be honest. But again, there was not any mention of my mental health. And inside, I was dying to say something. I was dying to say to her, I think I have postpartum something and I need help. But I didn't. Even though I am a very vocal person, I am fairly good at advocating for myself. And that also felt really disempowering, that I didn't speak up for myself. And now looking back, I also realized that I didn't feel like I had the space to do that, because my doctor never acknowledged mental health with me, never asked about it. Again, I'm crying, bawling my eyes out. Third time, breastfeeding's not working, and I was never asked any questions about my mental health. So I left the doctor's office. I'm in the car, bawling my eyes out. I'm like, I actually should probably pull over here. And so I did, and I called my doctor's office and I said, I'm not okay. I need to come back. I need an appointment tomorrow. So I got an appointment for the next day. I remember telling my mom that I was experiencing what I thought was postpartum depression. And even that was very scary to admit. Like, I'm not perfect. I'm broken. I felt broken and I need help. I remember calling my friends, kind of bawling to them on the phone, like, oh my God, this is what's happening to me. But that felt like a relief, to kind of say it out loud and acknowledge it multiple times in a row felt helpful. The next day I go back to the doctor's office and I tell her, I think I'm experiencing postpartum depression or anxiety. All I remember was my doctor told me some long story about the Olympics. I am not lying to you. That is all I remember. I couldn't connect to what she was saying. I felt like I wasn't even in the room. So that's all I remember. And at the end of it, I got a referral to Women's College Hospital in Toronto. At the time, I moved outside of the city, so I was about an hour drive from Women's College. And I think at first I was going twice a week and driving in with the baby, and that felt stressful. But I did it to, get that support. That in itself felt like a relief, like, okay, I'm getting help. And then the nurse called me to do the assessment. And she asked me if I was having intrusive thoughts. And I was like, no, because I didn't really know what that meant. Also, a part of me was scared to tell her the truth. Yeah, I have thoughts of dropping my baby down the stairs. I didn't think parents had those types of thoughts. And so I was embarrassed and I felt guilty and I felt shameful. And so I didn't say anything because I thought, do they report you to CAS if you have those kinds of thoughts? I didn't say, I was like, no, I don't have that. Then I remember she said to me, okay, we can get you an appointment in, I think it was like 2 weeks. And now if I think about getting an appointment with a major service provider in 2 weeks, I'm like, wow, that's really good. I panicked. I just started bawling. I said, there is no way that I'm going to make it to 2 weeks. I didn't even know what that meant at the time, but I was just like, I can't do that. She put me on the cancellation list and I was able to get an appointment, I don't know, within a week or something. That whole process can be taxing and difficult and tiring because you kind of have to tell your story multiple times to different people, and every time they're strangers. And so I'm super conscious of that as a therapist when someone's coming in and sharing their story with me, that this might have been, either the first time or maybe it's been multiple times that they've shared the story and that I'm a stranger. That can feel really, really scary when you are in this extremely vulnerable place. You don't know if you can trust yourself, let alone the stranger sitting across from you. I went through the assessment, and I just remember, all I remember is crying and feeding baby, trying to breastfeed him in the office and feeling like an imposter. Like, I'm trying to show you that I can breastfeed, but I can't actually breastfeed. And he's bawling because he's starving, the poor love. It was a lot. And I remember explaining to her that I truly, genuinely felt that anyone could just pick up my baby, feed him a bottle, and he could love them as their mother. Like, he does not need me. And I think that probably was concerning to her because, that's a bit of disconnection with yourself and your baby and reality, because that's not realistic. That's not true. And I know that now. I had the assessment with the psychiatrist, and then she diagnosed me with postpartum anxiety and depression and suggested that I start medication. And I said, absolutely not. I'm not starting medication. I don't need medication. All I need to do is breastfeed this baby better. I'll just try harder and I will be fine. Like, this will all go away. It's only because of the breastfeeding. I was just so hyper focused on that. I started therapy with a social worker. I think I was on a bit of a high because I got help, because that felt empowering. Like, okay, I advocated for myself. I got help. I got a diagnosis. I'm seeing a social worker. And so by the time I actually started the regular therapy sessions was about September, about 4 months postpartum. I was like, I think I don't actually need to be here. And the social worker was like, well, let's just see. And so I noticed that too now with clients, that they come in and they get excited and they feel good. And when they're starting to feel better, they're like, okay, I've got this. And they're super excited. But then, maybe they have some bad days, or they have a bit of a low for a little bit. And then that can feel really scary. Like, oh, I'm not actually doing as well as I thought I was. And so I do remember feeling that. I felt this high, like, okay, I'm getting better. See, told you, I don't need medication. I got this. I will be the best client ever for that therapist. Like, she will not have a client that's better than me, because if I ace this, therapy thing, I don't need meds. I'll be better. It means that I'm not broken and I can go and live my best life. And then I crashed. And then again, I kind of fell into those depths of despair, and it actually kind of felt worse. Like, I felt just really in the shit. And I thought, well, how do I get out of this? Trying harder to breastfeed my kid is not working, because trust me, I tried hard. Being the perfect client in therapy was not working. I couldn't even really integrate the coping skills that we were talking about in therapy. I couldn't kind of bring those out of the office and bring them into my day-to-day life. That's when I started contemplating medication, about 6 months postpartum, where I wasn't sleeping. The crying, like, I was just crying constantly. The guilt and the anxiety were all consuming. And I thought too, okay, I had a bit of a period of feeling better, and then I went down. What does this mean? My anxiety was just on overdrive. Am I going to be broken forever? How long is this going to take? I wanted all these absolutes from the therapist. How many sessions until I feel better? Okay, if I take medication, exactly how long do I have to take it until I can come off of it and I'm back to myself? How will my brain heal completely? I wanted the psychiatrist to run blood work on me to see, why did this happen to me? Is it a hormonal issue? Is it because of the breastfeeding? What is going on? And I couldn't get any of those answers. And I felt like I was drowning. I went in and I asked for an appointment with the psychiatrist to discuss medication. My psychiatrist was not in, so I had to speak to another psychiatrist. So I remember being so frustrated that I finally decided, okay, I'm agreeing to medication. I'm going to see what happens, because I'm not coping. Therapy's not working, in the sense that in the office, I was super engaged and I was really loving therapy, but I could not use the coping skills outside of therapy. And so I finally decide, okay, I'm going to try this medication thing. And now I have to sit in front of this psychiatrist and tell my whole story over again. And I just remember the anger. I think it was frustration that I need help and I need it immediately. And by that time, it just felt so like I waited so long and I suffered for 6 months. And so I was kind of like tired of suffering. I didn't want to suffer anymore. And then I had to wait 2 more weeks until that medication kicked in. So that was really, really, really tough. I started the medication, and then after a couple weeks, I felt super tired, like newborn baby tired, even though my 6-month-old and my other kids, thank goodness, were really good sleepers. And so they were sleeping through the night. So it wasn't because I had a baby. I really genuinely felt it was the medication. So then I had to go back to see the psychiatrist and make a change and try a new medication. So I had to wean off the old medication, start a new medication, and that can be so frustrating. And that's where I definitely see a lot of people just stop their medication, or, they don't take it daily. And again, I fully understand how frustrating it is. And it is so important to kind of keep going, keep trying new meds, and find the one that works for you, because so many times it is trial and error and not necessarily the first one that's going to work. After that, I did feel a lot better. And at 6-month mark, actually, when I started the medication, I decided, okay, I'm going to stop breastfeeding. Stopping breastfeeding was really hard because it was an admission that I wasn't perfect, that I was never going to do this again, because you can be sure that I was not having more than 3 kids. And that was it. And it felt like I failed. Even though once I got on the medication and I was feeling better, that kind of deep grief was really present and is still there. I will say that no, it does not hurt like it did then. However, if I think long enough about it, or if I see someone breastfeeding in public or on TV or something, I do get a reaction. I do kind of feel a bit jealous and sad. And so that's still there. And I think part of that is always going to be there, and that's okay. I continued with the therapy, and the program I was in offered therapy for up to the first year postpartum. And I was feeling good, and I was discharged from the program. I also kind of felt like at that year mark, okay, everything would kind of be perfect. There's that word again. And, I was definitely feeling a lot like myself, a lot better, which was great. But in terms of support and therapy, I felt a little unsupported. And what I mean by that is the year mark came up, my son's birthday came up, and then all these memories kept flooding in, or all these thoughts of that first year. So generally, I'm talking very general. If you've taken a year maternity leave, like I did with my 3, I went back to work at that year mark. Thinking about what my maternity looked like was really sad. I was just really sad about it, that a big, huge chunk, just over half of my maternity leave, did not look how I wanted it to look, what I thought it would look like. There was a lot of pain and suffering and not being connected to myself. And there were also a lot of memory gaps. And so we know that the memory part of our brain, the working memory, short-term memory, kind of shuts down when we're highly anxious, because we need all the reserves that we can get to kind of get through whatever situation is happening to us. And so I have a lot of gaps in my memory from that first 6 months, where I honestly don't really remember what my older 2 kids were like, what they look like or sounded like. It's really hard for me to remember. And even if I see pictures of them, I do get a bit sad, because I see the picture, but I don't remember what was going on. Whereas kind of every other picture I can tell you, oh yeah, we were here and we were doing this, and that's how that was. That was a struggle as well. And so it kind of felt like I'm grieving this time in my life, the experience. So what I'm trying to say is I felt like I could have used support kind of around that 1 year mark, because I wasn't even expecting that. Even now, my youngest is 9, but every year around his birthday, I think he was born 9 years ago. That was great. And also, it was a really difficult time in my life. And that's always going to be present. And that's, I think, part of that grief and that grief wound. And I do see this in my work as well with clients. And so I think it's really important to process that grief, to let that grief happen and come as it wants to, and support ourselves in that. I can't even tell you what the experience was like for my husband, because I don't really know. He was extremely supportive, And he was like, okay, I'm going to let you sleep as much as possible in those first 2 weeks when he was home, to avoid postpartum depression. And, he was really like taking care of the older two whenever he was home from work. And, just a really super present, awesome dad. And that didn't help stop the postpartum anxiety and depression from happening, even though it felt like we were super prepared. The other piece to my puzzle is I have been diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 40. I knew that ADHD was present for me when my youngest was about 1, because my oldest was diagnosed at that time. And then the psychiatrist was like, well, if he has it, either you or your husband have it. And I would always say, oh, he's so much like me, my oldest. And looking back, I was like, oh, right. The reason why I mention that is because I truly believe, because ADHD is a neurodiversity and my brain is wired differently. And I definitely believe that had a big impact on my postpartum experience. If I was diagnosed with ADHD at a younger age, and also, side note, I was diagnosed with ADHD and generalized anxiety disorder, which again, looking back before having kids, for most of my life, I would say anxiety has been present. And so if I knew that, maybe I would have already been on medication, which would have helped with my symptoms. I would have been prepared. I would have gotten in touch with a psychiatrist or at least my doctor and been monitoring for symptoms and knowing perhaps more to what to look for in terms of anxiety, because I would have known. Unfortunately, women are extremely underdiagnosed when it comes to ADHD and neurodiversity, and that is definitely something I'm going to continue to talk more about and advocate for. That is pretty much my story. After that, when my son was about 18 months, I decided to go back to school and become a counselor. I wanted to give back to the community. I wanted to help. I wanted to help other people. I wanted to be trained in perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. I went back to school. I loved it. I did really well, and I worked in the field, and now I have my private practice where I work with people who are struggling with these types of issues in the perinatal period, among many others. The reason why I highlight that is because I was able to make meaning from my experience, which is, I think, something we as humans strive to do. We want to make meaning. This couldn't have just happened for no reason, because then that would really suck. I was able to come through a time that was extremely difficult. I was able to get support. I was able to recover. Now I'm able to get back to the community to help others in my work, and that feels really good. I'm also more aware of how I feel, what my mental health symptoms are like on a particular day, and how to take care of myself. And I think that's probably been one of the most important takeaways of this whole experience. That's my story. Please feel free to take what you need from that story. Know that if you're experiencing any of the things that I kind of touched on or mentioned in this episode, that you are not alone. You are not the only one, and there is help. You can get better with treatment. Talk to someone. Talk to someone close to you that you trust first. Get some support. And if you feel like I'm just not coping, talk to your healthcare provider or look for a therapist. You can go on psychologytoday.com, search for a therapist who is experienced or has training in perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, or whatever situation you are going through. Try and get some help. If you think you need medication, then speak to your doctor and ask about those different options. Thank you so much for joining me today and for listening to my story. I hope that it was able to help you feel a little less alone, or maybe even just teach you something new about different experiences in the postpartum period. If you want to check us out, we are online at perinatalwellbeing.ca. And in the comments, I would love to hear from you. If you experience any of these things and you were able to find recovery, let us know. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please share this podcast with any of your friends or family members who may benefit from it. If you feel you are experiencing any of the symptoms or issues that we discussed today, please reach out to any one of your supports. You can also go to perinatalwellbeing.ca for more information, blog posts, and podcast episodes. Check out our new episode every other Wednesday.